Hi everyone, welcome back to IS 325. Today's conversation is about media in the Muslim world, and I don't want to disappoint you, but slide 2 will not be that same excerpt from the OIC Charter that I've shared with you several times this semester already, even though the mandate for the OIC to pay attention to the representation of Islam or the experience of Muslims around the world is still present and does apply to news media. It isn't something that the OIC specifically pays as much attention to as it does with the popular culture realm. Now, there are some notable exceptions, and one we'll talk about in the conclusion is depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in media, particularly in political cartoons around the world, but that's a pretty narrow example that I don't want to spend too much time on. There are also some perceptions around the world that there are media that are specific to the Muslim world, and what they actually are is media that are specific to certain countries in the Muslim world that have an intended worldwide audience, these being Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, but they don't speak on a pan-Arab or a pan-Muslim basis. So it's more a series of a whole bunch of case studies that we have across the Muslim world rather than a single overarching thing, and we'll try and look at the patterns as we go through this brief conversation. So let's start here with a slide that depicts sort of the mainstream media and the social media that we were considering when we first built this class in 2010. Now you'll see down below I use the word traditional in quotes because a traditional media model didn't include social media at all, that social media is a pretty new phenomenon, relatively speaking. When we at the University of Idaho were planning a Boris Symposium in 2009 and decided to focus on the role of social media in promoting change worldwide, there wasn't a lot of interest on the part of either campus or the public. They just hadn't really thought of it yet. And that means that in 2010, when we designed this, it still didn't really have a major role in the Muslim world. But by 2011, things had changed considerably when you had the Arab Spring, which had a major role for social media. So what I want to emphasize on this slide is that with social media, early on, there was no overt role for the government. So whereas there was a lot of state or corporate control, and oftentimes the corporations were owned by family members of the people who were in charge of the state in these sort of dynastic relationships that occupied many of the Muslim states, not all, but many, that even something that was corporate controlled or quote-unquote privately controlled could be controlled by association with the government. And we'll look at some ways that happens in a few slides after this. But social media was not. That at the time, there was no overt role for the government in blogs, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. There's other and new all the time, but not in 2010, 2011. And that meant when the uprisings, the social unrest emerged in 2011 with the Arab Spring, that social media was a major driver of this because they had not occupied that role. And I'm going to leave for my colleague, Professor Damon, to discuss democratization, the role of the Arab Spring overall. It's a super important event that transpires, and some would say is still ongoing and that we haven't maybe seen the end of the story yet. Others would say we have. But what is clear is that a role for the media was an important one, and it was a media that was different. So when you look at this traditional role, there was a clear differentiation between what was mainstream, what was state or corporate controlled, and what was individual or citizens and entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, one thing we found in the years since is that there's a sort of a learning curve on the part of dictators, which a colleague of ours at the University of Idaho, William J. Dobson, who wrote for Slate and several other outlets, published this book about 5 or 6 years ago, came to the University of Idaho to talk about. It's called The Dictator's Learning Curve. And what had happened is, in 2011, when these movements started and people said, look, the dictators will never be able to have firm control again because social media democratizes the access to information and the way in which news gets out. That maybe in the West, where there was a role of a free press and that didn't exist in most of the Muslim world, that social media would change that. And his argument was there had been lots of changes before. Lots of changes and lots of technologies that had influenced the Muslim world and other places, and where the dictators had to encounter. So you had the role of radio, of satellite TV, of shortwave, even of photocopiers, of like really basic kind of technologies that that people could access and get their word out, that at first flummoxed dictators and flummoxed people who were trying to exert state control over everything in a very overt way, but then they figured out how to deal with. And so radio is one of those that has the longest sort of arc in the region. BBC Radio and the later BBC Television has long had an Arab service. And so that's the BBC being broadcast in Arabic. And anybody with a transistor radio, though, unless the signals are jammed and you have to go to a shortwave radio, they have the ability to listen and to watch and to hear these alternate messages. But then the government could figure out how to jam radio signals or to watch for where the satellite, the antennas and other things existed. That as radio, the BBC Radio and Radio France, and then CNN International, which is not a radio technology but a satellite TV technology. This is their first graphic from the 1980s and early 90s. When they start to broadcast, and there was just a flowering of satellite dishes, and so what the dictators learned to do was to look at rooftop houses and fly over and sort of track where were the satellites, where were the antennas, who was using these things. So you really sort of devolved to basic attempts to use media to get the news out, which often goes to transistor radio. And it's still one of the ones that's most common. This photo here in the bottom right is of a Somali refugee living in a camp in Kenya, where they use radio broadcast to get the word out. And transistor radios still are that accessible technology that people have. You can buy dozens of transistor radios for the price of one smartphone, and so that is still one that is out there. But the point of Dobson was that the social media, even though it was new and exciting, was something that you could turn to, that there was going to be a learning curve. You would be out ahead of the dictators, but eventually the dictators would figure out how to turn that around. And some of it has to do with the way the internet is managed in different countries, where the gatekeeping is and what kind of internet you access. But this is a graph that shows the network connectivity in Iran in November of 2019. So it's almost a year to the day from when I'm recording this. I'm recording this on the 18th of November. And you can see on the 17th of November 2019, the ability of the Iranian authorities to basically shut down the internet, because they control the means of access, gave them this ability to quell unrest and to keep the news from getting out. And essentially what you're saying is the dictator's learning curve has reached fruition as they're able to do things. So there'll be an article from Wired magazine that I have here. It's optional for you, but if you'd like to understand how Iran could do that, then that's there for you. So essentially what you're saying, though, is that if you had this traditional model in 2010 that made this possible in 2011, that akin to what happened with these earlier on, where there's jamming and counter messaging, etc., or an attempt to track down who's using which technologies, that the dictator's learning curve was going to cycle around and make it so that they're still paying attention to these things later. So we do have that arc sort of in the last 10 years of this great hope, and I don't want to say despair now, because they're still able to gather and to organize in alternate ways, but it is more tightly controlled now than it was in 2011. It's sort of a new arm for state control. What does media freedom and control look like? Well, I would invite you to pause this if you'd like to spend a moment to understand the four boxes on the right. So the attempt to describe what was going on in the Muslim world paralleled what was an attempt to describe what's happening in other parts of the world. Did you have an authoritarian press? In other words, that's directly controlled. Did you have a loyalist press? So that's a press that didn't have to be told to write what you wanted, because they just kind of did. And one of the great examples of that was Castro's Cuba, and there's a few others now around the world where the press just kind of writes, not because they necessarily have to, but the press writes what the administration wants them to cover. A diverse press, now that's a little bit different. That's one where there may be some element of a state-controlled media. Sorry, there may be some element of a state-controlled media. I had a cough there. But there may also be a free media. Now, self-censorship is an interesting concept. That's one that basically is one where the state doesn't have to censor you because you censor yourself. And so censorship is one where the state is controlling what you're able to say. Self-censorship is where you don't make them control you, because you kind of get where they're coming from and you do it yourself. And then you have all the way to the free press. So there's this range of things in the domestic media in the OIC member states, but there's no single way. and there's none that is pan-Arab or pan-Muslim. What you're looking at in some of these over time is a decline in overt control. So if we go back to this one before, you had more authoritarian press 15, 25, 35, 45 years ago than you have now. But you have a mixed result. And so the state monopolies, or the relationship between the state controlling the media, has gone down. And some of it is because of the thing like Radio France, from the BBC, from CNN, from RTV, Russian television, from other outlets. But you have new entrepreneurs who are starting outlets as well that influence it. And then big funding agencies like the World Bank and the IMF frequently include as a requirement of giving money to states that they privatize industry. The question is, when they privatize, does that mean that they become more liberal, and then sort of on this continuum of mobilized to loyalist to diverse to free, does that necessarily happen when you shift from monopoly state control to privatization? And the answer is it's a mixed bag, because some are still loyal to the administration, others are not. And then there's still attempts to control in different media. In Iran, for example, there's the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, which is responsible for censoring media outlets and putting pressure on reporters to report in a certain way. And I listed several kinds of these that were extant in regards to popular culture in my previous conversation. There's others that are specific to the media. And the result of this increasing control, both of social media access, of your own sort of government social media controls, and of overt attempts to control social media narratives like we are experiencing in the United States, means that when you look at a global map of world press freedom in 2020, that the Muslim world is in the darker colors here. So the lighter the color on this map, then the more free a press is. So you'll see the freest presses in Western Europe and in New Zealand. And then beyond that, you have different shades of yellow, orange, red, and black. Now, press freedom doesn't necessarily mean only the ability to write whatever you want. So in Mexico, technically speaking, you have freedom of the press, but you also have a lot of violence towards reporters who say things that you don't like. So there's a number of factors, and I'm going to give you a link in the readings that can let you follow through and see what this means, and why Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Yemen and Libya and Egypt and Azerbaijan, etc., have these different very strict. The darkest color on here controls on press freedom. So like in this picture, you've got the Minister of Culture and Islamic Guidance of Iran on the one hand talking to his counterpart in a very similar role in Azerbaijan, and it doesn't mean that there's not really hope for a free press in these countries. So again, you'll have that link to be able to explore that more fully, and you'll see that if you follow through and look at the enemies of a free press, the strongest enemies, that Iran's up there on the top of the list, as are several other outlets like that. Al Jazeera enters the picture in 1996. This is a state-owned media. It's state-owned by Qatar, but the Qataris committed, like the British, who are state-owned, the British Broadcasting Corporation, or the Canadians, who have the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, to stay out of the creation or of the news. So this is a really interesting outward-facing media outlet that some people really were kind of worried about in the United States, particularly in the when we started the war on terror and in the war in Iraq, and that's part because of that Osama bin Laden would give tapes to Al Jazeera to broadcast, which they were doing as a media outlet, not as an arm of Islam. They are a pretty interesting news outlet, and one in which you get a traditional news experience without a lot of control from Qatar. In Saudi Arabia and Dubai started the Al Arabiya network in 2003, in part in response to the perspective that Al Jazeera was too outward-facing, in other words, to be a better news source for Muslims and for Arabs that's located there as well. I said that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about cartoons related to Muhammad, which are banned. It's forbidden in Islam, but some Western outlets have published them anyway. It's led to gigantic problems that the OIC is concerned about. I'll have to give you a reading for that instead. Just know that there have been improvements in the media. You got a good reading about the role of media in Indonesian democratization, but it's something of a mixed bag still.